This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's still cool out there. I went for my second virus this week, and that was interesting. It was -4 on Tuesday morning, and that's reasonably cold, and I could see my vehicle was covered up with a mountain of snow, so that was not a good alternative. And just getting it out of the yard, it would be a challenge. So I looked at bus schedules, and I found one bus, a Navy bus, that goes down First Street. And so the virus people are kind of skeptical about buses because they're not easy to sterilize. So that straight track meant that I didn't have to go through Campus Town, which has some concern about viruses. I was the only person on the bus, and I got out at the corner of St. Mary's Road and First Street, and I could waddle through the snow and find my way to the I Hotel conference room. It's a brand new conference room, and it's huge, and people can be sorted out. That was good. The needle went into the muscle part of your shoulder, because that's the way this particular vaccine works, rather than into a vein or an artery. And the needle was sharp. I could hardly feel the situation. And I came out through the hotel because I know the older conference room setup. And I went to go out the door, and a woman said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes, but if you know where the bus stop is." And then she was not sure that I should be outside, and was kind of surprised that I'd come in with a bus, because there's a fair bit of slippery plowed, but ridges of snow around. I'd been interested when I came in. There'd been some, in the place of salt, there's a mixture. It must have little worm-like pieces of melting material. So it was interesting. I was watching what I was standing on. And so we talked a little bit, and she decided that we should go out the front door, and she discovered where this was Susan, and Susan is a coordinator for venues. And so she called MTD and found out where the bus stop is, because there's several lines of buses go through this area. So there's 2 or 3 kiosks that you can shelter in. And then she decided that the weather was not good enough. She should give me a ride. So she gave me a ride back to Market Street, and that was rather wonderful because we talked. And she's married to a Danish person and had been in Australia. And when she was expecting twins, and they had made movements when she was sitting in the Sydney Botanical Gardens and watching over the harbour. So she remembers Sydney, and we chatted away on the way, and didn't take long, because Market Street, the south end of Market Street, is fairly near to First Street and to the I Hotel, so it didn't take very long. And it gave me time to for the day to carefully uncover my car from snow. You have to be careful as you get older. Moving a lot of snow is not a good idea. So I was careful. And that was my first part of my day. And it's that same day, gallery was closing in Australia. And that had brought me a little closer to my family. I've been here for a long, long time and have left my family behind. And so getting together with my sister, who had actually organized a gallery, was very nice to do, and to talk to other Australian people and to be working back and forth from here using computers was quite helpful and calming. Uh, I received a book from Bob Stake, and it is about caring. And I was thinking about that as I was thinking about caring about your family that's at home. And my home has been come here, but I have uh, a foot in both countries. Then I received a little journal from. Well, I'll deal with the steak situation later because it's steak and uh, Vissi, a European author, and uh, we can perhaps show the book a little bit, and we'll deal with that later. I need to read the book first. But I did get a Farmer City Mirror publication. It's from the Farmer City Genealogical and Historical Society, and I was asked some years ago to be at their 175th anniversary and say something about Prairie, and so knowing that and knowing Farmer City some and knowing that Farmer City is going to have rail abandonment that will probably be, well, I think almost certainly will be a rail trail. I wanted to suggest to Farmer City that they think about the possible parameters around a rail trail. There's room for restaurants and bicycle shops, and it always helps to upgrade. It's a little bit challenging for people because it's something new, and change is always a little challenging. But it should not be something that sort of moves in and dominates a community. So I thought to write to them just to inform them that the trail will be coming through. And they did go to the planning people and are aware that this is going to happen. But they asked me if they could use my letter in the little brochure that they send out 4 times a year. It's not that small. It's full of a lot of information. So I thought this is pretty good. Many of these small communities, uh, they're in flat communities. They don't have a huge mountain. They don't have a river. They have streams and they have drainage ditches. But you often wonder what people do in those situations. It's a microclimate, and it has some of the cold that we're having now. And so the introduction was more or less saying something about that. It's virus time, and all these small communities have their problems with that virus too. And it goes back to uh, other eras when uh, at first people were coming through with horses and carts and oxen and covered wagons and settling. And so there's some of this history, and it's not that old. Some of the people who were here were still youthful in 1830s, and so their grandparents and or later when they were grandparents, the young folk were still around. So uh, I thought I'd run through some of the sorts of things that would get reported in this. Uh, so I look at my notes here, and I think one of the first things was uh, to report on people whom they'd lost in the year. That's not unusual. That's in passing. Then there was a reminder of some of their settlement history. The first railroad coming in probably in the 1870s. So where should it go? Where should there be machine shops that would work with railroads? Would they be at Clinton, which is in the same county? And Clinton has the county seat, but Farmer City has at least two railroads and possibly a third. And so there's a little bit of competition between the communities around about. And there's a relationship to Bloomington on the west, northwest side, and to places like Champaign-Urbana. And so there was early settlement, and there was trains coming through for the first time, and in a cold weather like this, the rails would crack and there would be derailments. And the one of the lines that goes through Gibson, Farmer City, ends up in Urbana and goes through to Danville. The Danville to Urbana piece has now become the Kickapoo Trail, but the line is still viable to Mansfield. But it used to go from Mansfield to Farmer City and on to Bloomington. If you're looking at this as an interim trail use, there's a connection there. It's more than just a small grain line. If you look at some of our abandoned territories, they're small communities with small sidings and not a lot of grain. And the efficiency has been that big elevators have replaced little wooden elevators that aren't very efficient with big facilities with several large sidings so that you can load several trains and send them out to a connecting line. So in case of Cargill's west of Champaign, the connecting line is to Mansfield, and a Norfolk Southern line that goes north and south. So they have an outlet. They can also turn around and come into Canadian National, or it used to be Illinois Central, and send their grain in a different directions. So it always helps to have more than one outlet, so you can argue the benefits of sending grain in different directions. Some of the first cars were wooden cars, and that was pretty difficult because if you had a crash, wooden cars go to splinters. So later, the wooden cars were some of the furniture would be wooden, but the underpinning I-beams would be steel, and they were safer. But some of these lines were moving at a fair pace, and so if you had a crash, then that would be a problem. Up near Strawn, there was a east-west line, and somehow the culvert had been burned out. And so a train that was moving at a fair pace with passengers had quite a memorial uh, accident there. So progress has been made. There was still a lot of horses. Horses had been prominent in the Civil War. Uh, Horses, there were people that held horses while the cavalry got off the horses and did battle. So, and even when I came here uh, in the 60s, there were people who had their plowing horses, their teams, still there, even though they'd bought a tractor. Horses were part of their lifestyle. These were their friends, and they were going to make sure that they retired and passed on uh, in a farm situation and not be sent off to a meat factory or a glue factory. So there were still horses around, and even to today, there are people who, on the time when draft horses especially were a very important part of the scenery. I know if you wanted to go off to town with a sulky, you had to have a lightweight horse. Uh, uh, and these horses became specialists in a way. So some would know how to turn on a furrow, and others would know how to back up. And it was almost as if the team would talk to each other and understand each other. So the trains would have to have depots. There was a nickel plate line, and what did it say? It says, I'd better walk. It was like some of these trains didn't move very fast, and they would wait to do business, and so that was the nickname for the one of the lines. I think it was perhaps the Big Four. A little bit of sarcasm about using the railroads, but that's what they had. Before that, they had oxen and horses, and the oxen were much better because they could handle mud. It was cloven feet, and horses couldn't do that so easily. And you also had to shoe your horses and look after them in a slightly different way. The oxen could graze, horses could graze, but you also had to feed them separately and perhaps groom them too. So the railroad line came through, and there was a depot, and the depot at Farmer City was a wooden depot. And that was also a little dangerous because in winter, when you have to heat with coal and open stoves and fireplaces, that can get you into a fire situation. So then you have to have a volunteer fire group, often on big wheels, and volunteers pull these. Later, the horses did that, but fire was part of the scenery. There had to be a post office. There had to be a hotel. If you came to town, you took time to come to town with a horse, so you stayed, and you had to have a hotel to do that. There needed to be gaming, and you met with people and spent out your wages and had some fun. And so hotels were very much a part. There were theaters that came in and gave fun and games. There was no internet. There was no video. These were often proscenium stages where people could dance and do comedian things, and that was a fun thing to do. There were celebrations. In 1909, there was a 100-year celebration of Abe Lincoln's birth. So people would celebrate and sing and dance and play music. And many of the houses had front verandas and lounge rooms that were big enough to handle a piano and a cat and a canary and uh, ambiance and pictures uh, that were interesting, and people could join in. Uh, they would sometimes get dressed up for these occasions. And that too was interesting. So you had to have uh, stores that sold clothing, and that often was handled by Jewish people. There might be only one or two Jewish families in town, but they had a different culture, and so that had to be shared with the Scots and the Irish and the Germans and the Italians, and sometimes a community would become more dominant in one particular ethnic group than another, but people had to learn about each other. There were some uh, people who took advantage of the railroad line. There's a little report in this brochure that uh, there was some happening on the uh, junction of the rails down the line a bit, and the signalman uh, went to investigate, and there were some thieves who were putting a spike in the junction of two railroad spurs with the intent of derailing the train, and then they would be able to steal. Some of these thefts were serious, and the gentleman got involved. He they exchanged on both sides a little bit of gunplay. So things had to have some constabulary. So eventually you had to have police stations. And all these things were happening slowly. And there had to be drainage. The farmers couldn't work the land unless you had a drain. And interesting that in Farmer City, there's a drain that goes out and runs into the cooling pool for the nuclear power plant there at where Lake Clinton is, and that reminds you that this small community is now within cooey of a major nuclear power plant, and what do you do about that? So uh, the agriculture was changing from livestock, which could graze. So you had hay, you had uh, improved pastures, and to row crops, which dug up the pasture, which in turn had been replaced from prairie. And I was talking about a little bit of prairie on the railroad bed, and that's why I wrote my first letter to Farmer City to remind them that a very wide trail would take out some of the only prairie we have left. And you've heard me talking about that before. There were people, there were doctors, and each town had a doctor's, not quite so the same anymore. Small communities are often hard pushed to have a doctor, but the doctors had to have early operations and appendicitis and some of the more straightforward operations had to be followed by cancer and other operations. It was lonely. Sometimes people would lose their wife. Sometimes the wives would lose their husbands. Sometimes uh, the husbands had come a long way from Europe, and they were in difficult times. It was a little bit like the virus time now, and some of them would commit suicide because they didn't feel like they were succeeding in life and why concern themselves. And then doctors would have to try and figure out what was going on and could they save that sort of person. And eventually you would have hospitals. A lot of those small hospitals have now lost their situation. They were usually a mile out of town, so you didn't have to greet your indigent people. People who had mental problems were there. Sometimes prisoners were there, but they often had a farm, and the farm allowed people to improve their mental health or provide crops that kept the nursing home intact and with available food they produced themselves. Most of those counties homes have been removed or adapted for other uses, and they were often 1-story, 2-story, 3-story. Today they're replaced by nursing homes that are 1-story, so you don't have to have people climbing up stairwells. There had to be schools, and there had to be teachers, and the teachers had to board somewhere. And early teachers were male, and then that was followed by women being teachers. And they were often leaders in the community, and they knew people. So they were psychological people in a way. There are people who have had families who have kept their archives. They had basements and they had attics, and that was a prime place where people put their archives. It wasn't a very good place because basements are damp, and so are attics. It's the prime suggestion of archivists and librarians that you don't keep information in those places. But often, years and years later, a cache of information would be found in those places. Sometimes it was early photography. People had a box brownie camera, and it had a lens which wasn't couldn't be adjusted. But if you were at the right time in the right place with the right focus, you could record what was going on. You could have a darkroom if you were innovative, and you could play with photography so that you could have a tree that had someone sitting in the tree. It was almost unnoticeable that you had put the person in the tree by photography, and that would spook people out. So Mr. Sidoris did that, and it's not sure, but he ended up in the Kankakee Nut House, and probably because people felt that this was mentally problematic. And so you had rules of the game. You had the Victorian rules. You had dresses that were long. Ankles were a sexy experience. Uh, and so there were ethnic groups came with their own styles, which were interesting, but not always functional. If you're going to ride a horse, side saddle wasn't a very good idea. You needed to be on that saddle and able to handle a horse, especially if you were handling cattle. There are people who come to the Genealogical Society looking for information. It may be the orphan train. There was a little power, someone who's writing a book about orphan trains. Orphan trains came because there were people in cities like New York that had lost their parents, often children that were hungry, and they were also a potential workforce. So these children were gathered up and put on orphan trains that came to the Midwest, and they would stay in hotels, and then people would come and offer to be in charge of them. Some people were looking for workforce, and they could make child labor a reality. Some were keeping sisters and brothers together and creating a family life for them in a very different manner. So all the orphan children have a very different story, and it continued. It continued probably up into the 60s and 70s. There were still people coming to the Midwest, and I walked into a parking lot not too long ago, and there was a gentleman there who'd had a heart problem, so he was working on as an attendant in a parking lot. I got to know him, and I found out that he had indeed come to the Midwest as an orphan, and he had run away from 2 or 3 situations where he was being used for labor, and it was a rather cruel situation. So he made his way through, and he got through university, and then somebody discovered that he hadn't even gotten a high school degree. So how could he graduate from the university? Well, he became a promoter for an industry and did very well at it. I think he was working for the hotels and met his wife there, and they joined in and became specialists in providing food for one of the major hotel chains worldwide. And then he got older and got a heart attack, and he was still working. But he was also writing a book, like the person that was in this little brochure that was asking if they had a picture of the hotel where the orphan children were housed, and it's portioned out to various people who would care for them. So some people will provide some money to the organization to do some research, and that brings a little income. So you then have to think about the society and who's the society, and what do they write, and what do they find in past eras, and who was Mr. Woodward, who married Mr. One of the Bashers, and uh, so there's a lot of interest here. Uh, they have booklets they can sell, copies of mirrors, and they can give talks, and it's a rather viable little place. I think that I'm going to close there because I should give you the address of the Farmer City uh, organization. It's on Main Street, and it's 224 Main Street, Farmer City, 61842. And it's typical of a whole bunch of small communities that bring together their people, and it relates to the sort of thing that we're talking about is caring about each other, caring about families, caring about people who pass on and leave people who are orphans and the like. So I think as you go through little towns, think about uh, a Scandinavian town, an Italian town. Think about the Italian towns that came here with gambling and created a gambling town, which didn't go down very well when you got into Puritan involvement and an era of no drinking and uh, the conveying of liquor and prostitution and things like this. It was there, and it's part of the fun of knowing what was your past. So uh, it might be that you have an interest. So as an artist, you put up a fence or you put up a something that's interesting and intriguing that everyone will come to see, or you put it in a museum uh, where art can be shared and people can dance and you find products like coal that might be underground and you can dig mines, and so the people from Kentucky come in because they know where they're doing it. Might be people from Wales who are used to mining, and so you get your coal and that becomes your fuel. Other people rely on peat and bog material and uh, trying to uh, utilize forests for wood. We lost a lot of forests that way. Even trains at one stage were running on wood uh, when there was not much coal. So think about your small towns. Some of them were sunset towns. That meant there were not very many black people around, and they weren't cared about. And so this virus era has uh, emphasized some of the things that uh, are associated with the different levels of people. And so there was possibly a mansion where the man was the leader and had a lot of acreage because he came here with money. And then there were the people who were more the peons that had to make that work. Sometimes there was a main street adjacent to the railroad line. Sometimes it was at right angles, and you could find different structures in the corridor. There were churches, sometimes grand churches and sometimes simple churches, and people who were prepared to uh, love God in a very formal manner, and sometimes there were holy rollers who were very spiritual and very loud about it, and you could hear the church in operation. There were small manufacturing places, and uh, there was competition between uh, Farmer City in Clinton because they needed a machine shop that would work with the railroads, and so you get some conflict. There were grandmas here, so if your grandma was from Ireland and somebody else's grandma was from Germany, they may not be the same grandmas, but they are both very interesting, and so you get these sort of snippets in these sorts of magazines. So I'm going to say goodbye now. I don't think I have pictures to provide, but there are maps and there are photographs, and some of them, portraits, for instance, the person had to hold very still because the camera was going to take a long exposure. But all these little tidbits get together and make for an understanding of life that was, which has an influence on the life that is. And we don't always realize it unless we go back to look at it. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And thanks to WEFT and to Urbana Public Television, who puts this up on Channel 6 and on YouTube during the week.